All right, so thanks everybody. I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm not seeing any more stragglers coming on up. My name is TJ VanToll. I work on the developer relations team at Progress, and I'm here to talk to you today about NativeScript and specifically the NativeScript UI. Now, I'm going to keep things hopefully moving pretty fast today. I'm going to do a quick introduction to NativeScript UI in case you haven't heard it before, in case it's something that's new to you. But the majority of our time today, I'm just going to demo. I'm just going to give you a whirlwind tour of everything in NativeScript UI. So we're going to see a lot of code. We're going to see a lot of controls in action today. So first of all, though, if NativeScript UI is new to you, if you haven't heard it before, NativeScript UI is first and foremost just a NativeScript plugin. You install it just like any other NativeScript plugin, TNS plugin you add. It's kind of like a super plugin though, because there are 7 different UI components in one. So normally you'd install a plugin, you leverage one different control. There's 7 in NativeScript UI that do quite a few different things that we'll look at today. NativeScript UI does support both Angular and non-Angular usage, so regardless of whether you are building Angular apps, whether you're building with TypeScript, JavaScript, you can use the controls, the docs, the demos, all those sorts of things have these documented for all these different architectures. And of course the controls used to have different free and paid tiers, but as of today, these controls are now completely free to use in your apps without any restrictions or anything like that. So one minor sort of logistical note, especially for those of you that were already using NativeScript UI. So the old NPM packages used to be NativeScript Telerik UI Pro and NativeScript Telerik UI. So we're not getting rid of those packages. They're going to stay out in NPM just basically because we don't want to break your existing apps. They'll sit out there indefinitely. But the new package moving forward is called NativeScript Pro UI. It's the exact same thing really as NativeScript. Even I can't get all the names quite right. It's the exact same thing as the Pro controls before. This one just has all the different licensing and stuff ripped out. So it's just completely free, easy to use plugin that you can install into your apps. So with that, I said I'd keep things really brief and that we'd spend the majority of our time doing a demo. The 7 controls that I'm going to demo, I've got them here for you. We've got a side drawer, a list view, a data form, an autocomplete calendar, a chart, and gauges. Now I'll warn you before we get started that I sort of designed this to be a fast-paced look. We're going to just take a tour of everything in NativeScript UI. So I don't want you to concentrate too much on the individual API and the individual syntax. We've got like a half hour today. You're not going to memorize each individual control. Instead, what I want you to think about is see what these controls can do. And if you see something that you think might be valuable in the next app that either you're building right now or that you might be building, just make a mental bookmark and sort of keep in mind where that's going to be. So along with that, this will be a whirlwind tour, but I want to have a little bit of fun too. So if you've seen some of my talks before, you might know I am from the state of Michigan. And the thing I like to do in my talks is I like to poke fun at Michigan. Turns out Michigan is a really easy state to poke fun at because there's just some really absolutely crazy things that happen in our state. So we could spend an entire day talking about the bizarreness of it. But today I've got some Michigan fun facts, some of which are sort of fun, some of which are a little bit bizarre that I'll help use to drive these demos. So demos, Michigan facts is what is on the agenda today. Now the last thing I'll show before I actually dive into code, and I have to actually end the slideshow so you see this. Over here, the 2 best places to go for NativeScript UI, so if you get done with this talk and you're like, I want to try this control out, but I don't remember exactly the syntax or how it works. The first place to go is the NativeScript UI docs. It's over on docs.telerik.com. I'll have all these links at the end, so you don't need to memorize them or necessarily take pictures of them at the moment. You'll see all of the controls documented, as I mentioned before, both for Angular and non-Angular usage, so both are out there documented on the site. The best place, though, I find to sort of get familiar with NativeScript UI is there's 2 different sample apps that the NativeScript UI team puts out on GitHub. So one is at github.com/telerik/nativescript-ui-samples. The other one just is the same thing with -Angular appended to the URL. And as you might imagine, it's pretty much the exact same app, just built with different architectures, one with NativeScript Core and one with Angular. This app is nice because it's basically a kitchen sink. It's basically everything that these controls can do in one place, and I'm actually going to show this as part of the demos. All right, so I want to dive in. I promised 7 Michigan fun facts. My first is kind of a positive about Michigan. You might not know this, but Michigan actually has the most freshwater coastline, the most public golf courses, and the most non-motorized trails. So in Michigan, our tourism industry needs a little bit of help. So I thought, why don't I use the first of these NativeScript UI controls, the side drawer, to start up a little app. So here is the demo workspace that I'll be using for most of our time today. So I've got my app up here. I've got a really simple app. It's just showing an action bar over on iOS or Android. And I'll be using this to drive this demo. And I've got it on my CLI, I've got a watcher, so all my changes will get pushed out to both of these devices. And I'm going to start, I mentioned the side drawer is going to be first, so I'll paste in the basic markup to make the side drawer happen. Now, you'll see for all of these NativeScript UI controls, you'll start to notice this as a pattern in a minute. If you're using the controls through NativeScript Core, so if you're not using Angular, the basic pattern is you have to import each individual control's XML namespace. So this is the drawer here pointing at that new NativeScript Pro UI package from NPM. And once you have that namespace imported, you're then able to use that control in your markup. Now, if this were an Angular app, the code would just be a little bit different. Instead of declaring this in my markup, I would have my ng module, whatever ng module controls this component in my app, and I would have to register a different module there so that the Angular directives continue to work. But the actual markup itself is pretty much identical regardless of both. Now the side drawer, the way it works, if you think about just a side drawer, especially one that apps use for navigation, you really divide your app into two parts. You say what's in the drawer and what isn't, what's the main content. And when you're using the side drawer, the NativeScript UI side drawer, you specify it in these two different locations. And so right now these are empty, which is why you don't see anything on the screen. So I'm going to paste in a little bit of code that does a little something more. What I'm going to say is in the drawer content, so the area that's going to be on the side of the screen, I'm going to put some basic navigation. So if we picture this as a tourism app, eventually this would be the links to navigate around this app, and that's what's appearing here. And in the main content, I've just got a single button that's going to let me actually open up that drawer. And my watcher, where's my watcher? So I'm in the dev day app. So I did have a watcher running. I didn't push that button out, although it did get the first change. So we'll see if the demo gods are with me today. While I'm waiting for that button to get deployed. I have a drawer in a drawer? Thank you very much. So one thing you can't do is put a drawer in a drawer. Which is kind of funny because one of the most common feature requests we got is people that want to use multiple drawers on the same page, like one you want to slide into the side. And at the moment you can't do that. And apparently if you try to do it, it fails nice and silently for you. So now with this button and, okay, here we go. I'm back on track now. So now if I do that and I paste in a basic amount of code, don't worry about this code necessarily. This is just your typical NativeScript sort of template. All I'm really doing is opening up the drawer when I click this button. And now when I click open drawer, my code comes in, my drawer comes in from the side of the screen. So this is the basic pattern. You'll see this repeated over and over again. You bring in the XML namespace if you're working with NativeScript Core apps. You put the controls in your markup. And then from there, there's a bunch of different attributes and APIs that you can use to configure these controls to sort of meet the needs of your application. So I'll give you a few ideas for each of these. I could spend a lot of time on each of these controls. I'm just going to point out 2 or 3 popular options for each of these. For the drawer, you can control the location the drawer opens from. Maybe you want a drawer on the right. Maybe you want the drawer on the bottom. I've used this before in some of my apps if I wanted, like, say, an options menu. Maybe up here I'd have a little icon, and when I clicked it, I'd have some actions the user could take kind of up on the bottom of the screen. So that one comes in handy sometimes. I'll switch, take drawer location back out. Another one, if I can type it correctly, is show over navigation. There we go. Now, you'll notice that by default, the drawer, oh, there we go. By default, the drawer normally does not cover up the action bar and the status bar on the screen. And sometimes you want that, sometimes you don't. I've heard designers, I've argued with Jen about this. Jen, I personally always put my drawers over the navigation bar, but Jen doesn't like them, so whatever your design team likes, you just have an attribute that you can use to control that. So that's the side drawer. I could go over this a lot. I guess one other common question that comes up with the drawer is people want to know, how do I, like, let's say I'm using this for a navigation menu, how do I share this code so I don't have to specify this multiple different times in my application? I'm not going to go over a full architectural deep dive as part of this session, but I will point out that in NativeScript Sidekick, when it loads here, some of those starter kits that you saw during the keynote, one of them is specifically for drawer navigation, and it has some of those patterns sort of pre-baked in for how you share your code, how you share that menu so you don't have to declare it multiple times. It's conveniently not loading for me, but when you see the app templates, the drawer is part of that. All right, so that is the side drawer. This is going to be the pattern for the rest of this talk. We're going to go through, look at one of these controls, get a quick glance at what these can do so you can get an idea if you can use them in your app. So I got to go back. I promised 7 Michigan fun facts. There's only one U.S. president from the state of Michigan. Does anybody know the U.S. president from the state of Michigan? What was that?
Ford?
Not Ford, no. It is...
44 to go.
No, it is your report. I'm falling apart. I haven't had enough coffee today. So guys, let me tell you, it's been a long day. I've got to keep this under control. I've got 30 minutes, and then we got lunch lined up. So the U.S. president of Michigan is Gerald Ford. I've been to his presidential library in Grand Rapids. I thought you might want to know about some other fun people from the state of Michigan, and what better way to do that than the list view controls. See, look at that segue. I've got this going so strong now. I'm going to paste in the control for the list view. You'll again notice the pattern. Bring in the namespace, do something with the control. Now with the list view specifically, and let me get Sidekick out of here. With the list view specifically, this API might look familiar if you've used the list view that's built into just NativeScript core. The API is going to work pretty much the same. You have to pass the list view an array of data through its items. So basically you're saying, here's my list, and then you have a template where you say how each individual item in this list should be rendered on the screen. So I've got a stack layout. I'm going to be pasting some basic details in here. And to do that, I just need to populate that array. So I'm going to back out of this and go with some famous people to expose that to this control. And when that loads, you'll see our list of people from Michigan. Now this, of course, is basically doing nothing that the built-in list view can't do. It's really the same exact thing. But again, like with the side drawer, there are attributes that I can use to add powerful functionality to this control. Now one, I use a decent amount. I'm going to give this thing just a quick height, which is what I'm doing here. And when I do that, what I can do is I can change I wanted to change the scroll direction first. So I had the scroll direction set to vertical. If I make this horizontal instead, so right now the user scrolls through this list view this way, but you've probably seen apps, it's really common in video apps, so like the Netflix app or the YouTube app does this where you can scroll things horizontally instead of vertically. So in the list view, it's just one attribute that you can use to turn on that behavior, and probably a little bit of dimension configuring as well. So there's that. If you want to use these layouts, you can also, I was going to show earlier, there's other layouts as well for more complex things. So if I wanted to, for example, I got to get rid of the height for this one to work. If I wanted to show my data in, say, a grid instead, say like I wanted to build cards or something on the screen, I can control that through a grid layout. So I'm saying I want to put 3 of these individual items on each row that you see on the screen. There's what's called a staggered layout as well. So imagine you had different images that were different dimensions and you wanted to figure out a way to arrange them on the screen. There's a layout for doing that sort of thing as well. The last thing I'll show, just because this comes up a lot, this is part of the keynote as well, you can implement pull to refresh pretty easily in these controls as well. So there's a single attribute to turn pull to refresh mode on, and then there's a function you have to implement that basically tells the control, how do I want to actually handle when the user does this, or whatever. Normally you would call backend endpoint and actually get some data. So I'm going to do that and head in here, and what my refresh list, so this is the actual handler that's going to handle when the user does the pull to refresh. Now normally here I would make some sort of HTTP call, or I would check my backend to see if I had new data. In this case I'm just simply waiting 2 seconds just to keep things a little bit simple, and then just adding an item to the top of the list. And so I go back here and I'll get rid of the layout so we can just see this with the default layout in place. Let that get pushed out. And now when I refresh, I can see items on the top of the list. Again, this isn't revolutionary. This isn't going to make or break. You're not going to be up on Apple's stage talking about the most revolutionary thing you built. But it's pretty powerful that you can add pretty decent mobile functionality through a simple attribute. It's really, this is what, still only a dozen lines of markup and a little bit more than that in TypeScript code. So I wanted to show you, I mentioned the samples app earlier, and I've got it running on my device here. And this is really the kitchen sink of NativeScript. So for each of these controls, you can see them listed top level. You really just get a full list of everything these controls can do, including some of them that are a little harder for me to get up and running, like item reorder. Say you want to let users sort things in your list. This is going to work, again, if you have, like, say, the horizontal layout, and all the different layouts support the reordering as well. So that's one thing you can do. Swipe actions is another one that I tend to use quite a bit. So if you want the user to be able to swipe to do things, it supports both, swipe and the thing completely goes away, or you can set up sort of endpoints where the swipe just sort of shows some action that the user can click, so it's configurable and you can take either approach. So that's the list view. We are now 2 out of 7. I think we're doing pretty good on time. And that means I need another Michigan fun fact. This time I'll try to remember my fun fact for you. This one's, so I've been doing a couple more positive ones. This one's maybe less positive. The city of Detroit, you might know, is kind of famous for having the largest municipal bankruptcy in the history of the United States. Sort of go Detroit. The city's about $20 billion in debt. And so I thought we'd build a little app. The data form is the next control I want to show. Data form helps you generate forms and add forms easily to your app. So I'm going to build a little form to help us contribute to the Detroit bankruptcy fund, because that's pretty fun. So I'm going to head back into this app here, and I'm going to say, all right, we're going to go back to a blank starting point for this data form. Again, pattern still holds. Bring in an XML namespace, bring in this control. The data form to start is a pretty simple API. Essentially, you have to point the thing at a JavaScript object. Say, at a high level, the data form says, I have a JavaScript object and I want to make a form for the user to manipulate that object from. So they have some properties and such. So in this case, I'm going to start, just so you can see this in action, I'm going to start with a very simple JavaScript object. I created a customer class that we're going to use to power this form, and I'm going to set that as the on the data binding here. And what the data form does, so remember that all I did was point it at a source object, which is this new customer, and I automatically get a form that helps me manipulate this object, and this customer object will actually get changed behind the hood as I interact with this form. Now, most of your forms are probably not going to be this simple, right? Forms get pretty complex. There's a lot that go into them. So I'm going to add, I don't want to go crazy as part of this demo, but I'll make this slightly more realistic. And instead of just doing a name, we'll say we'll try to collect some basic credit card information. So we'll get an address, credit card number, expiration date, month, and year. And you can see that in the data form, push these values out here, and I have a functioning form for this, but this is probably not the form you want to ship to production. This isn't configured. I don't think users would be especially happy if you ship this. So what you can do is, as part of this data form, there are different properties that you can pass to this. It's actually quite a lot you can do to configure these. Now at a high level, what you'll probably want to start to do is add an entity property for each entry in your JavaScript object. And so, oh yeah, it took effect. So there's a one-to-one mapping. You remember my customer object had name, address, and card data, and then these entity properties do it as well. Now all I'm doing to control this at the moment is I'm just telling it what label to use. So I've got a little colon display that it popped up in here. And I'm also controlling the order of these. So by default, the data form doesn't necessarily know what order you want those properties displayed in your form. And so I'm giving it an index to pop up there. Now this is better. This is still not necessarily perfect, just because this is probably not how you would choose to configure expiration month and expiration year. You probably, again, I don't think your users would be very happy with this. So another thing you could do is configure the individual editor that the data form is going to use to capture this data. And so I'm going to take this entity property, and I'm going to use, basically if I can pick different editors to use to configure these values. So by default, this control sees, hey, it looks at the data type and says, hey, this is a number. I think the user might want to use a stepper to configure this. So it could detect that automatically. But instead now I'm saying, actually, I'm going to use a different type. I'm going to use a picker. And NativeScript's data form will render the control this way on iOS. And it's got a little pop-up interface on Android. So something that feels a little more like the native select that would be available on these individual platforms. So there's a lot you can do here. These things are pretty powerful, especially if you're building an app that has quite a few forms and you want to save a bit of time. And also build an app that looks pretty decent out of the box. So I showed one different editor. There are a ton of these things. So if I go into data form, oops, I gotta back up one more time. If I go into data form and look at all the different editors, so just to give you an idea, you can do, here's the picker interface we saw before. You can tap into the native date and time pickers. There's more or less radio button controls. It'll also handle picking the correct keyboard for you. So if I go into the phone number or the email, the control knows to give the user the correct keyboard, both on iOS and Android. There's a little bit of a checkbox control as well. There's a full validation framework built into this as well. This is probably the main reason I actually use this control, because wiring that up yourself manually can be a bit of a pain. There's common validators for things like required fields, if you just want to mark those. There's more complex ones that you can make. For instance, if you had a password policy, or you wanted to enforce that users type correct emails. These are all things you can do. The way that the messages show are just built directly into the framework. So it can be a pretty big time saver, again, especially if you're building an app that uses forms in a non-trivial way. So that is 3 out of 7. We are 3/7 of the way in, which means I have to do another fun fact. Hopefully you found the data form interesting. Fact number 4, 74% of the US's tart cherries come from Michigan. If you ever choose to visit Michigan, one of the places you want to visit, so Traverse City is right up around here, produces a lot of cherries. They make cherry wine. It's a great place to visit. You might want to check that out. And I thought, to show the 4th of our controls, the autocomplete control, I built a little autocomplete that shows some other Michigan cities that you might not know about. So, I'm going to go back here, and I'll again wipe this out and put in a little autocomplete control. Again, XML namespace to bring this in. I got to switch over to, oops, not that. I got to switch over to the DevDay app so we can look at the autocomplete control. At a high level, the autocomplete works a lot like the list view. You have to pass it an array of data. So if you think about how an autocomplete works, essentially you have to feed the control what are the list of possible suggestions, things that you might want to suggest to the user. So the autocomplete will take that in behind the scenes. The other thing you have to apply is a template, or essentially when the user starts typing, how should those suggestions be displayed to the user? Where are they going to see those on the screen? And I think this is one of those things that's a little bit easier to see visually. So I just have to feed this the appropriate items to use. So if I go back into my TypeScript code, I will paste in a little bit of code that just feeds that items list. And I've got some Michigan cities here that we'll use to do our autocomplete. And the default behavior of this, and I'll show it on Android here, is as you start typing, again, this isn't really styled. This is just sort of showing a basic label in a stack layout. But it provides the functionality that as I start typing, I see suggestions, filtered suggestions based off what I'm doing. So that's the basic behavior of this control. It's sort of the built-in functionality. But like all of these controls, there's a lot of different things I can do by configuring this. So if I head to the autocomplete and I turn on, let's see, there's this suggest mode attribute. Now by default, the control is in suggest mode, which means as I'm typing, it shows the suggestions underneath of the control. If I put the thing in append mode, it'll instead turn into almost like a autocomplete, where as you start typing, the value sort of gets completed. The user can use, say, like the space bar, whatever, to autocomplete that value. There's also suggest append mode if you like both of these options, if you want the user to have a little help seeing a value getting completed and also seeing a value underneath. So see, especially if I do it with a D here, I can do this sort of thing to complete these values. So there's a few different options built into this control for how you want to do that, any place you have autocomplete data. This also integrates into the data form, so if you have a data form and you want an autocomplete in your data form, you could do that as well. It's one of those editors that are provided as part of the data form. And the last thing I'll show, so this is an autocomplete that you might use, say, picture you're building a flight tracker and you want to type in what airport you're going for. You can probably use something like this to show the list of controls. But there's also the sort of autocomplete where you're sort of filtering values. If you can think like the Yelp app or something where you say, I want restaurants within 50 miles, and you can sort of chain those filters up. So there's another mode built into this, and I'll switch this back to a pen and change the display mode to token. And what that'll do, now this doesn't really make sense in the context of Michigan cities. I don't know why I would necessarily want to chain Michigan cities up, so you'll have to suspend disbelief here for a minute. But the way this works is I can just start typing and adding these controls, and it'll add tokens directly into the text box where the user is typing. And I can get rid of these things. I could keep going. So you get events for these things as well, so you could picture yourself, I'm just adding filters to my control, and each time the user does that, I subscribe to that event, I change the list of data that I'm showing to them. So this is built into this as well. And you can, as part of those tokens, do some cool things as well. There's one example in the kitchen sink app. So suppose you wanted to be a little bit more creative. My design skills are not all that great, but if you had country drop down or something else, you could play around with these templates to make something look pretty nice. So that's the autocomplete. I think we're doing pretty good on time here. I'm now at 4 out of 7. I saved my favorite 2 for slot 5 and 6 for no particular reason, just sort of arbitrarily picked that. And that's because they're 2 of the more feature complete controls, as you'll see in a second. But first, I promised Michigan fun facts, and my fun fact 5 is that Mackinac Island has banned all cars. Has anybody here been to Mackinac Island? I'm curious. One person. Well, awesome. So it's a really cool island. This is totally an aside though, but it's right by where the Lower Peninsula and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan meet, and it's just a quick little island. There are no cars on the island, and as such, you have to get around by horse-drawn carriage, or biking is really big on the island. It's like 8 miles to bike around it. It's really nice. You get this nice view of the Mackinac Bridge between the Lower Peninsula and the Upper Peninsula. So pretty fun. Obviously my segues between these in the demos, not necessarily the greatest, but my segue is maybe you want to see events in Michigan, and what might you use for that? Well, hey, a calendar control would be really nice to do that sort of thing. So we're going to take a look at the 5th of our controls, which is the calendar. The calendar I like because the API is about as simple as it gets. To start, you just type in calendar. You bring in the namespace and type that. And when you do that, you get, out of the box, a completely native Android or iOS calendar control. I should also mention, I probably should have mentioned this at the top, but NativeScript UI, under the hood, all of these controls are built with completely native code. So back in the day with Telerik, we had products called UI for NativeScript and UI for iOS, which were controls written from the ground up in native code. And really what NativeScript UI is JavaScript wrappers of these controls. So these aren't built with, this isn't a collection of NativeScript stack layouts or grid layouts you're seeing here. This is actually implemented in Objective-C or Java. And so you get the performance you'd expect out of these sort of natively written controls. And you can see this calendar, especially if you play around with this yourself, really feels nice to use on the device. I've got some transitions to show that off in action. So a calendar, right, pretty basic. Chances are your next great app is not just going to show a calendar and not do anything. So if we want to add some things to here, I'm going to add in event source, and I'll type it right. A lot of these controls, their basic API is you're pointing at an array of data. The calendar, at least you don't have to use it for events, but I see it's most commonly used for events. You pass out an array of events that you want to use. And so I've got some fun Michigan events lined up for us. The only difference with the calendar control is with the list view and the autocomplete, typically you're just passing more or less basic strings to the control. With the calendar, you have to give it some date and time information, like an end date and a start date and that sort of thing. And so there's an API built into the calendar called calendar event. I'm getting here from NativeScript Pro UI, that you have to feed it an array of those things if you're using the calendar event mode. So once you do that, you can see I've got some little dots lit up here on iOS, and the events are showing on Android as well. Typically you would use this with an event view mode, and I'll start with inline mode. So you can picture, this is the Michigan Tourism app. You've got a number of events you want to show to your users. They come to this view and they say, oh hey, looks like there's a Red Wings game on the 6th, or we're going to go biking around Mackinac on the 4th. Android will do the same sort of inline view here if I use it in this mode. There is another mode that's supported on Android called popover mode. And as its name sort of implies, when I actually interact with one of these cells, it's just going to pop over the appropriate event data right on my screen. So that is that. There's, again, the calendar. One of the reasons I like saving it a little bit is just because there is a ton that this thing can do. So if I go back here and look at the calendar, you can do things like localization. You can add programmatic controls. So imagine you have a calendar and you want to give the user a way to traverse between months or that sort of thing. That's built in as well. There are selection modes. So imagine you're building an app where the user needs to select a date. Maybe they're scheduling an appointment or something like that. You can build that into it. There's range selection as well. So think you're building the next great hotel booking app, and you need your users to pick what days are you going to be in a certain town. That's built into this control as well. And I promised transitions, so I got to get there. There is a styling example. I was almost hesitant to use this because I don't know which of our designers actually implemented this. I wouldn't necessarily make my calendars look like this, but I do like to show this because, again, thinking about different app scenarios, so say you were building a scheduling app and you wanted to make certain days red or green based off their availability. So there are APIs in the control to do that sort of thing as well. So that's styling. There are also some transitions. So I don't know if this is practical. I don't know if I'd recommend doing this for my applications, but hey, if you can convince your manager that this is an essential need for your application, go for it. I encourage you to try. You can also, one other thing I wanted to show too is the view modes. Here they are. So by default, I'm seeing a week view. I can show other views as well. Maybe I want to show a view, out view calendar. Like I wanted to show somebody what days of the year certain things are happening on. I can do that with this control as well. So like I said, I do encourage you to sort of play with this because even in like a half hour and this sort of eclectic look at the controls, there's just a lot in there that you can do. So speaking of that, we've only got a few minutes left, but I've saved the best one for last. The charting library in NativeScript UI Pro, I mean, it's a fully featured chart library that stands on its own that's built into this plugin. It's probably as feature complete as all of the other controls in the suite combined. I do have one fun fact to accompany this. Charts typically show some sort of data. Michigan, believe it or not, was the only state in the United States to lose population in the 2010 census. So go Michigan. But I do have some data I'm going to show to give you an idea of why that might have happened. And so I'm going to switch back in here, and we're going to load up a basic chart. The chart APIs, there's usually a little bit more to them in terms of markup, just because there is a lot you can configure. There's a lot of different data you can show in this chart. Again, like a lot of these controls, I have to pass in some array data. So I've got some population data. I've got population data both for the city of Detroit, which is the most populated city in Michigan, and also Grand Rapids, which is the second most populous city in Michigan. I've got that data set over time. And so when I save this, you might see a trend difference between the two cities in terms of how the values of the populations of these cities have changed over time. But the more important thing is just how easy it is. I mean, these are completely native iOS and Android charts, right? Like you could see the little animation on iOS, for example, of how these lines were drawn. And this is something, again, I'm building this with, 30 lines of markup and really only 5 or 10 lines of JavaScript if we take out just the raw hard-coded data. So it's pretty powerful what you can do with these controls. And this one, like I said, more than any of them. So I'm not going to get too deep into the APIs. You can get in the weeds here pretty quickly. But the sort of short story is you have to provide the chart a set of series. Now, line series is basically like a line chart, right? Which is why you saw the lines at the beginning of the screen. You can instead just change that. You say I switched to bar series, and now this data is showing using a bar chart as well. There are, I don't know how many series there are. There are a bunch of these. So if I change to area series, for example, I get a completely different look at this chart. I could switch, for example, if I decide I want to switch the axes of this chart, I can flip these over and you'll see the chart's going to sort of flip 90 degrees there. One last feature, and then I'll switch back over to the app, is I can add a legend. So as is, if you showed this to a user, they probably would have no idea what this data actually is. And if I do that, then each series I can give a legend title. So this is going to be Detroit. This one is going to be legend title of Grand Rapids. And I get a little legend that I can use. But, there we go. But as I said, oops, didn't necessarily need to do that, but that's all right. There's a ton in this charting library, so I could spend the next few minutes going through this. So I showed a few of these series, but there's also things like bubble series, scatter plots. There's some things in here that I'm pretty sure you need a statistics degree to understand. Like I don't even know what's going on in here, but you can do it. So pretty cool stuff. The last of our controls, I've got a few minutes, I don't want to keep you from lunch. So the last of our controls is the gauge control. My final fun fact to sort of wrap all of this up is there's this place called the Sleeping Bear Dunes in Michigan. Have you been to the Sleeping Bear Dunes at all? No, so this is one nobody's been to. It was named the most beautiful place in America in 2011. I'm sure it was a very scientific study that came to that conclusion. But it's a really fun place. It's an inexplicable ton of sand right up at the top of Michigan. And it's really fun, especially if you have kids to take and run around. So add that to your list sometime. But I did want to leave with one fact about this, and I will use the gauge control to do that. So the gauge is sort of for showing circular data in your app. Think like a speedometer or any sort of gauge like that. And the point I wanted to make is that from all of these locations, there's a specific time of year you want to visit. That time of year is about right now. So if you go in winter, it's not a whole lot of fun. So plan your trip accordingly. So that's the gauge data. Hopefully, I promised a whirlwind tour. Hopefully I didn't disappoint. What I hope you got out of this sort of eclectic run through is just some ideas of things that you might want to do in your app, some user interfaces you might want to build. Now, you can look at the NativeScript UI docs. They're over at docs.telerik.com. The sample apps that I showed are available on those repos at GitHub. What I do recommend you do is just clone those sample apps and keep those around as sort of copy and paste starting points. Most of the demos you saw today, I just sort of took a bit of markup, a bit of TypeScript from those apps and then sort of configured them to meet my demo. So that's something I'd recommend you try out as well. And yeah, that's about it. So if you have any questions, feel free.